welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. I'm David Tao. Viewers, this is the fifth and final program in our big picture series, Theories of Civilisation, in which we've traversed the major flows of history and the evolution of civilisation from its very beginnings around 12,000 years ago, following the end of the last glaciation period, through to the present. 12,000 years ago, the major river deltas were incredibly fertile and plants such as cereals grew there naturally. Humans discovered this and decided to stay there, and eventually they were able to farm these areas, to develop those crops further and understand what made them grow better and how they could live more permanently in these sites. To do this, they had to develop number systems, they had to develop prototype alphabets, and they had to develop early writing systems, and they had to develop a whole range of arts and crafts and building practices to survive in these areas. And they did it in a remarkably short time, we found. But we also found that they did it independently in each of these major river deltas: the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Yangtze, the Indus, the Ganges. All across the planet, the evolution of early civilization proceeded in a similar manner because it had to. There were drivers there. If you were going to farm crops, you had to keep records. If you were going to keep records, you had to have people to do it, so you've got a segregated type of society. You had to protect those resources. You had to build villages, permanent villages and towns around them. So all these centres, this is the first major pattern that we discovered in this series, developed independently, over and over again. Now in the second program we saw that one of the major features of early civilization was of course trade. Early humans learnt that they couldn't produce all their resources themselves, as we can't today, and so they developed bonds between different civilizations and traded around the major cities that grew in these major river deltas. So they did this, and so these cities became hubs, and these hubs expanded, and their influence expanded right across the areas the trade areas that they commanded, and became the prototype empires, the early first empires. So that's what we covered in our second program. These empires extended, for example, in the Middle East, from the Assyrian and the Babylonian and the Egyptian, and they were vanquished eventually by the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was defeated by the Greek Empire, and these empires were huge. They stretched from the Persian Gulf to India, and eventually the Greek Empire succumbed to the Roman Empire. But the pattern we found in that second program was that cultures merged and mixed. What merged and mixed was the information, the knowledge of those cultures, the arts, crafts, architecture, technology, languages, law, everything that they learned. Even though they were conquered, the conquerors took the best bits and combined them with their own special flavours of civilization, their own spins, if you like, combined them and gained synergy. And this happened over and over again right across Europe, and it happened right across also into Asia as well. All the early empires built and leveraged on top of the others. So what was important here was the flow of information, not which empire conquered which. And we know this because following the disintegration of the Roman Empire, largely through the strength of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, the growth of that empire, and also later in the 12th century, Genghis Khan hordes overran Eastern Europe, the Slavic areas, and then moved towards Western Europe. And they demolished knowledge and culture as they went. But we find that eventually, 3 generations later, his descendant, the last descendant, the Kublai Khan, established one of the most sophisticated, one of the most open, one of the most built on Confucian ideals, a civilization in the Middle Kingdom in China. The major centre, Dadu, was open to all traders, all religions, was a patron of the arts, was a wonderful centre. Technology, knowledge grew apace. So in a few generations, from a great marauder to a great builder. So this has happened throughout history. So it doesn't really matter in the longer term. It matters to the individuals at that time. Which side wins which battle? What matters is the flow of information and knowledge, and that transfer from the past to the future. In a very similar manner, in fact, that space-time is now predicated on flows of information from the deep past to the deep future. In the third of our programs, we looked at the evolution of the nation-state, because this was the building block eventually that created our present-day civilization. A more complex system, in fact. The nation-state coalesced from the early empires, really. And the nation-state was different because it centralised power, originally in the monarchy, but eventually in parliaments, the people themselves, after huge civil wars and battles to determine who would gain the upper hand here. But it was inevitable that this happened. These nation-states were built around common culture, common language, and was very centralised in their processes. Originally, as I say, run by monarchs, but eventually not. And they had to learn how to run these nation-states, these new nation-states, efficiently. But as with empires, they constantly warred with each other. They constantly formed alliances. They coalesced into mini-empires, such as the Austrian Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Russian Empire. But all the major nation-states, such as England and France and Spain, evolved out of the chaos that occurred after the disintegration of the major empires. And they needed structures on which to build. They needed economic structures, financial structures, administrative structures. They needed to develop all those things, which they did, with huge effort and going through the same sort of learning curve that the empires went through. At the same time, if you're going to trade, you need strong financial structures. You need strong legal structures to balance individuals against the power of the state, and also to maintain sound financial practice. All these new structures and new institutions, including the major democratic institutions, the representative institutions of parliaments, had to evolve also. And there were battles between the three classes: the typical original aristocracy classes and the monarch, the new middle classes, the new wealthy farmers, and later the new wealthy capitalists, and then the lower classes as well. All needed equity and a proper share in decision making and control over their destiny, and they got it eventually. As we saw, the big catalyst for all this in our fourth program was the revolutions triggered by the huge surges, the tidal wave of knowledge in science, on which was tiered the huge tidal wave of technology. In other words, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and then the social revolutions. Because what opened up here was a new way of living, a new understanding that individuals were as important as kings. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. It changed work practices, it changed the flow of humanity from the farms, from the country into the cities, where everything was manufactured using steam power, electric power, combustion power. And out of that emerged the new capitalist classes and the new capitalist society and new capitalist economic theories, as well as the counterbalancing it, another way of looking at the distribution of wealth through the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. But that was a little premature in the mid-19th century and didn't take off. But broadly speaking, politics emerged, economics emerged, capitalism emerged, and a whole new way of governing countries, which form the basis today from which has crystallised our modern civilization. However, nationalism wasn't sufficient to prevent the enormity of the wars and slaughter that occurred early in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, because nationalism has a dark side as well and can be manipulated, especially if the aspirations of the nations have not been felt to have been met, if they have been stymied by those in power, as happened in Germany. So new regimes, fascist regimes, Nazism arose, and the rest is basically history. And because that revolution failed, again it triggered the next round, the Second World War. But out of that came the beginning of this century's new model, the beginning of globalisation, because out of that wreckage was seen the need for a new type of global structure. Originally the League of Nations, and eventually in the Second World War, a more powerful structure after the Second World War, the United Nations, providing a meta-view of humanity beyond nation states, beyond sovereign states, towards an understanding that human rights had to dominate the national interests, the narrow national interests, and sometimes the hegemony of nation states. And so these institutions were created and presaged globalisation today. So viewers, what is this thing called globalisation? How do we define it? Well, first of all, it's really about interconnectedness. It's about enmeshment. It's about relationships between people. It's the relationships between institutions, organisations, between governments, etc. We've discussed networks a number of times on this show. Networks are a very useful structure that underpins, that allows us to model, if you like, the underpinnings of things as diverse as space-time and the internet, a network of networks. Networks display relationships between, as I say, between almost everything on this planet. They're alive in ecosystems, for example. They show the relationships between different species and their interdependencies. They can show the relationships between disease, bacteria, viruses, hosts and pathogens and whatever. So basically they can show the relationships between the chemical processes that occur in a cell and certainly between the neurons in a brain. So interconnectedness displayed through networks, if you like, or understood through networks, are what globalisation is about. Globalisation is not solely about trade. Trade, obviously, is a critical process that involves a vast amount of interconnectedness, relationships between organisations. Trust has to be engendered, and of course trade was one of the first processes that got underway with early civilization. Remember, those early civilizations started independently in different places on the planet, in the different river deltas. There was virtually no connectedness, or very little at the beginning. Later, as the empires developed, there was huge interconnectedness. Cultures overlapped with each other, cultures drew on other cultures, tiered on them, built on them, and exchanged information. And we find that when we talk about globalisation, we're coming to the real crux of civilization itself. The real theories, if you like, the real patterns underlying civilization and history. We're talking about information theory, network theory, chaos, and complexity theory, because underpinning all of these is this notion of relatedness. More important than the individual items themselves, the connectedness. So over the eons, and of course, of civilization, of course, going beyond to the first global empires driven by advances in navigation, the first colonisations, that extended the connectedness. It extended globalisation in those days beyond the Mediterranean across to new worlds, such as the Americans, and across, of course, to India and China, and now Indonesia. So we can see that globalisation has been occurring for a long time, and with that expansion, with those global empires, there was a huge exchange of information and culture. The British Empire covered 25% of the planet. The Spanish one probably did too, or close to it at different stages, and they brought their cultures to bear on other cultures. In the process, they often wiped out portions of others' cultures, but also they added to those cultures, and eventually those indigenous cultures incorporated the colonisers, the best bits of the colonisers' culture into their own. So it was a two-way flow, actually, eventually. So when we talk about trade, we're also talking about financial connections, of course. Modern day, there's vast networks of protocols, financial protocols to facilitate trade, vast large numbers of protocols in the legal sense to ensure that financial transactions, trade transactions can be adhered to regardless of the country. In other words, nations will not do business with other countries that cannot provide transparent protocols relating to financial and legal connectedness. So this is globalisation. Of course, governments have numerous treaties, and especially after the first two world wars, especially relating to United Nations treaties, treaties on human rights, treaties on children. But what's important to understand beyond the connectedness is the drivers, the actual forces at play that underplay this, and how rapidly they're being activated. Now, viewers, let's examine these critical drivers towards globalisation and see whether it is in fact an inevitable process or not, whether it's just in fact something that happens at random. The drivers are very, very strong. Take communication, for example. One driver of globalisation, and again, it's all about information here and networks. It's about the exchange of information via networks of connections. So the internet is, of course, the perfect vehicle for this. The internet will eventually connect just about every household, at least every village, and already most, even the poorest villages, have some form of internet connection which assists them in their day-to-day life, weather forecasts, whatever. So this ability to connect anywhere, anytime, and of course through wireless connections as opposed to wired, so that the poorer countries like Africa can leapfrog our previous technology and go straight into the wireless network, is absolutely critical. So the connectedness is driven by advances in communication and computing, which are proceeding at a massive rate. That's the sort of technology underneath that's driving it, because you can't fail to increase the number exponentially of connections if you have the facilities to do it. But the really big drivers, of course, are the problems of the world. The problems of the world as opposed to the problems of nations. Nations have led us over the past 4 or 5 centuries to a belief, nation states, to a belief that things can be boxed in, that actually the planet's problems or the planet's phenomena, the planet's actions, if you like, or the things that occur on the planet can be sort of split into simple compartments. An instant's thought rejects that notion completely. But they did encapsulate particular cultures, particular tribal cultures, languages, etc. And that's the more potent reason for their establishment. But when you come to physical phenomena, and we're talking the weather particularly, let's take weather and let's take global biodiversity of life, that's where those boundaries become quite non-essential. So we're talking weather. Weather has no boundaries, and of course global warming is the big driver. It has to be solved at a meta-national level, beyond national boundaries, obviously. And everyone's involved because everyone's affected. And if something happens in one nation state, in one country, in China, for example, there's an explosion of carbon dioxide emissions, that's going to affect everyone, not just China. And the West has driven, for example, the carbon dioxide emission increases in recent years, and that's affected everyone globally. So that's the first reason why globalisation, or one of the main reasons, beyond technology, which is a facilitator really, that's the main reason why globalisation has to occur. Because if you're going to solve those problems which are global, they have to be solved on an intranational basis, on a global basis. If you're talking globalisation, therefore, you're going to need institutions that facilitate that. You're going to need institutions such as the World Bank, World Trade Organisation, International Monetary Fund, and most particularly the United Nations, and special institutions, protocols such as Kyoto to handle specific problem areas such as global warming. So that's a driver. Biodiversity is another one. The extinction of fish in the oceans, they know no boundaries, no national boundaries. Animals of all sorts becoming extinct or endangered across the planet, and of course interconnectedness between climate and those extinctions and changes in patterns and technology and global movements of people. Remember, at the end of the first millennium, there was only about 1/3 of a billion people on this planet, about 300 million. And very quickly, by the end of that millennium, there were probably around about 2 billion people. The beginning, in fact, of this century. By 1950, there were about 3 billion, and now there are 6 billion. So, population flows bring in the other major problem area of migration. People who are homeless, people who want to move, need to move across national boundaries. This has to be tackled at a global level. When we talk about solving global problems such as global warming, migration patterns, rise of the seas, endangered species, we have to involve everyone. If we're going to involve everyone, there has to be some sort of supranational body, and the only one possible at this point in time, imperfect though it may be, is the United Nations. Because there's now a new recognition that only by involving all nations on earth can we really solve major problems, and that goes for crime as well as beneficial solutions for problems in the health area, for example, and that's another big driver. When you've got a pathogen causing malaria or SARS or tuberculosis or HIV, then obviously these things are global and have to be solved at a global level. They can't be solved in patches. No one country is immune from major pathogens, viruses that can travel anywhere at any time. We could talk for a long time about globalisation, and we probably will bring it into future programs, because it's obviously of massive concern to all of us. The process is taking place at a huge rate, as I mentioned, as exemplified by overarching treaties and institutions that tackle things at a global or at least a regional level. And you can take as a model for the future of this planet the European Union. Europe, as we saw in our previous programs, has been racked with wars continuously. Early empires, the beginnings of nation states, right up to this last century. And there's been a recognition that one way to help solve this and bring great benefits of wealth to everyone as well are to simplify protocols between countries and to enable them to work together cooperatively rather than in competition constantly. So you have the European Union. The European Union is a tremendous model for what is coming in the future. There appears to be a coalescence of nation states into major blocs now, and they're not just trading blocs. Remember, the European Union is concerned with issues like education, health and safety, workers' rights, etc. Now, this can only mean that wars will become increasingly difficult to promulgate in those areas. How can you have war when countries are so intermeshed that anything one does or any differences between two of them affect everyone immediately? That's always been true to some degree, but with the more enmeshment you have, the more people travelling, living, constantly changing roles, jobs, doing deals with each other, institutions that cross boundaries, the more of that you have, the less chance there is of really major wars. You might have minor skirmishes, but that's about it. So the world at this stage is moving towards this regional basis. There's the North America group of countries, and that extends right down now from Canada through the US, Mexico, South America. There are treaties in place, the NAFTA treaty, for example, the European Union, Africa itself, even Africa, poor Africa, hit by drought, hit by HIV, hit by colonisation followed by despots and dictators. Even it has formed an African League to facilitate regional trade and regional exchange of ideas and knowledge. The same goes for Asia. Not only ASEAN, countries of Southeast Asia, but there's links now being suggested between China and Asian countries and also Japan. So you will have at least an East Asian and probably a total Asian bloc. And there'll be other minor blocs, hopefully in the Middle East as well. These will subsume rivalries relating to religions, etc., because the enmeshment will involve and allow for all types of religions and freedoms. It may take time. I mean, we're in an age where we expect instant solutions. These things can't be done instantly because they've evolved over thousands of years and will require further evolution and heaps of mediation to solve. But these are the regional groupings of the world. As well, we have overarching treaties, again, as I mentioned, the rights of women, children, workers, human rights generally, and conventions regarding trade and finance, global stock exchanges, for example. So when you've got that, you're getting close to, and as was pushed earlier on in the League of Nations and United Nations, for a world federation, if you like. And that's gradually what is emerging, whether people like it or not. That retains sovereign national cultures, identities. That's critical, always has been. But overarching that, to solve the big problems, you have global concern, you have global cooperation. And that seems pretty eminently sensible, and it's a feedback loop that will not stop. There may be ups and downs. We've seen several recently, several terrible perturbations in this process. But basically, it will be an ongoing process, people, groups, nations intermeshing for the common good, if you like, for their own good, for everyone's good, even sharing currency, sharing whatever is needed to improve and enhance human potential and national potential. But overall, a global village is emerging. A global village facilitated by the internet and facilitated by a common understanding of human nature. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.